Let's try this again. Is there anybody in the chat that can tell me if this is working or not right now? Please speak if this is actually streaming. Cool. Okay. We're good to go. Sorry about the delay there. That was probably weird just to watch me sitting down like that, staring into the screen for so long. So I'll start the intro over again since the last broadcast got cut off. I've decided to start doing these pretty much every day instead of ranting on Twitter. I just find Twitter to just be really unsatisfying to actually get my points out and to have people actually understand them as well. And yesterday's broadcast was basically compelled by a Twitter argument, and it was basically just all about Tulsi Gabbard's foreign policy rhetoric, and I broke down why I find her rhetoric problematic from an anti-imperialist, anti-war perspective. But today, something different, something a little less controversial. It's not going to anger people who would normally be in my audience, but hopefully it generates anger in another sense, which is Trump's administration and Trump's buildup to a potential war with Iran. Something that we have been fearing, that Abby and I have been fearing, a lot of people I know have been fearing since Trump got in office, basically. And that fear increased when he appointed John Bolton to be his National Security Council advisor or whatever. So now it looks like the Trump administration is actually maneuvering in a very strong way in that direction, in a way that they have not done yet. The biggest, I guess, signal that we had before this was pulling out of the Iran deal, which was probably one of the only really positive accomplishments during the Obama administration. So we knew that something bad was going to happen as a result of that. We knew that the Trump administration seemed completely in bed with the Israeli Likudnik Netanyahu government to an extent that I had frankly never seen before from an administration, not even the Bush administration. So all those were really bad signs. We still saw John Bolton going to MEK events, getting paid speaking fees. Rudy Giuliani, who was acting as Trump's counsel or lawyer or whatever his official position is now, he was going to MEK events getting paid. Newt Gingrich was still getting paid by MEK. Newt Gingrich, if people aren't aware, his wife is actually the ambassador to the Vatican, and he has been acting as a shadow advisor to Trump during his entire administration. It was actually one of the only time I had a source tell me anything in the last couple of years that I didn't already get from other reporters was that Newt Gingrich actually wrote part of Trump's national security foreign policy guidelines that came out, I believe last January, that mentioned, basically aggressively going after Iran, along with McMaster and some other people that I forgot the names of. But Newt Gingrich was one of the authors of that paper. He wasn't actually credited on it. In fact, no one was credited on it. So people sort of speculated as to who was behind it. And Newt Gingrich, according to a source, was one of the co-authors of that. So, these are all people. And someone also mentioned Nancy Pelosi spoke at MEK. I wasn't aware of that. I'm not surprised at that. I already know that Howard Dean was really in bed with the MEK. In fact, if you want to watch one of the best interviews with a Democratic politician being confronted with some of the stuff, watch Abby's Howard Dean interview on Breaking the Set. It's one of the most incredible interviews that she did. She breaks down and asks him about MEK, and he tries to wiggle out of it, and it's quite a sight to see. Teresa Peterson says Obama was just involved with Israel. I think she means just as involved with Israel. It was just hidden. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there was definitely a time in the Obama administration where he was working, the CIA was working with MEK and the Mossad to assassinate nuclear scientists and plant Stuxnet in their nuclear centrifuges. However, Teresa, I don't know if you remember this, but Netanyahu actually came to Congress to try to speak and go over Obama's head because he was so furious about the Iranian nuclear deal. So you can't discount that. This actually is an administration that is far more in bed with the Netanyahu administration than the previous administration. I mean, that's made pretty clear. Trump has not done anything to defy or really publicly disagree with Netanyahu in any way. And Obama's administration, to their credit, actually did do that in their second term. So, that can't be completely ignored. I mean, the Iran deal, I will say it again, was probably one of the most positive acts of the Obama administration. It is really one of the only good things that he did before leaving office. And that got torn up very quickly. But let me just go through, I'm trying to establish a chronology here because I haven't really been paying close enough attention to the buildup here. And I should have been paying closer attention. So I'm going to show you basically where this all seemed to have started. There is two different incidents, one involving the supposed attack on two Saudi oil tankers. I say supposed because I don't know if it was a real attack. It seems straight out of a Tom Clancy novel from like the early 2000s. Like a lot of these think tank pieces of shit were writing like fantasy novels, like Richard Clarke. Wrote a fantasy novel after he wrote Against All Enemies, something that people praised him for defying the Bush administration on. His novel following up that book was a piece of shit, like Tom Clancy, head up its ass, like 24 style terrorism tale about, I think it was actually about Iranian terrorists crashing an oil tanker into like an American port and causing like a giant explosion or something like that. So this is like a fantasy pipe dream that a lot of these American think tankers and national security people have had for years. This idea of like oil tankers being attacked by terrorists. I mean, you'll even remember Robert Baer, who's got some questionable spook, sheep dippy behavior, actually put that as one of the planks of the story in Syriana, where these disenfranchised oil workers in the Middle East were so upset at the American colonialists that they decided to crash a ship, sort of USS Cole style. When I say crash a ship, I mean like a little boat into the side of an oil tanker. That shit's bullshit. I mean, I don't know. I'm not actually gonna delve into the details about what happened to these Saudi ships, but I'm just gonna lean in the area of extreme skepticism that this attack was even something on the outside. I'm leaning towards it was some kind of inside job. Saudis did this to themselves, kind of psychopathic behavior. And it's possible that someone else did this. I mean, it's definitely possible. And we already know that Saudi Arabia loves hiring proxy forces to do shit, and they love using other groups, bad actors, to make themselves look like the victim or to meddle around all these different countries all over the world. So that being said, it's just a suspicious incident in and of itself. On its face, to me, it's suspicious. David Kapoor says the ships were empty. If you could provide a link, David, saying that, I would appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, Tinfoil Hoodie says Tom Clancy was pretty moderate. Brad Thor is premier, the neocon novelist. I mean, that might be a fair point, but I mean, go back to some of Tom Clancy's writings, and it does seem like whoever conducted the 9/11 attacks were actually partly inspired by his writings. Tom Clancy also, I believe, he had some involvement in Operation Dark Winter as well. The anthrax bioterror drill. There are some really interesting, bizarre things involving Tom Clancy and his ideas being not only used by neocons, but even possibly used by the people who conduct some of these attacks. John Gold says Robert Baer's work was used at the Iran 9/11 trial. That's a shame. If that's the case, I'm not sure which way it was used, like if it was used against or for the argument that Iran had something to do with 9/11. You have to spell that out for me. Oh, that's what it is. Yeah, bayonets and harmonicas just reminded me of why I drew that connection. That Tom Clancy video game, The Division, I'm not sure how much Tom Clancy was involved in that, is actually based on the theoretical scenario proposed in the neocon pipe dream psychotic fantasy Dark Winter. That is actually, it just came out like I think a few months ago or something, maybe a year ago. So these two Saudi oil tankers were attacked, and John Gold, who's in this chat right now, he just sent me an article about what John Bolton had to say about it. Actually, no, it's from the Onion. Unfortunately, I thought this was a real article, John. You tricked me. I'll just read it anyways. John Bolton from the Onion says an attack on two Saudi oil tankers is an attack on all Americans. I mean, we are entering that territory where I honestly, when I saw that headline, I did not think it was from the Onion. I wasn't paying attention. I just assumed, yeah, that's, of course he actually believes that, because that's how fucking psychotic he is. The mask is off. I mean, that's the one thing we can thank Trump for and his administration, is that the mask is off. These people are openly, brazenly, just balls to the wall neocon warmongers to an extent that we haven't really seen or heard from since like Dick Cheney era in office, in terms of like taking the mask off of what's really going on here. Rhizome says there was an attack. He calls it an even faker attack on UAE ports preceding the Saudi tanker attack. I actually didn't hear about that. So if you can provide a link in the chat, please do that. So let me play for you a news report about these tankers, just so you can understand the way the news is reporting on this. And to the mainstream media's credit, there is surprisingly some, I say some, very little, tiny bit of pushback against the Trump administration's rhetoric in Iran. And this is a difference between their rhetoric against Venezuela and Syria, where the mainstream media seemed completely ready to join in and beat the drums with them. This is slightly different. But here, I'll play you the clip that I saw today, or sorry, a couple days ago. Give me a second to cue this up. Amateur hour YouTube streamer here. Okay, and the way that this program does this, the video is going to be choppy, but hopefully you guys can actually hear the audio. So I'm going to play it, and I'm going to look at the chat as I'm playing it to make sure you guys can actually hear this.
U.S. investigators believe Iran, or groups backed by Iran, are behind attacks on 4 oil tankers in the Persian Gulf region. The incidents come amid growing tensions. The New York Times reports the White House is reviewing military plans for a possible conflict with Iran, and as many as 120,000 U.S. troops could be deployed to the Middle East. And the report says the plans do not envision a land invasion of Iran. Imtiaz Tayeb is following developments from London. Imtiaz, good morning.
Good morning. Well, investigations are still underway into what exactly happened to those 4 oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia say they were, quote, sabotaged, with U.S. officials saying they believe Iran was involved. Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, has denied that and accused Washington of escalating the situation. An online maritime shipping service, quoting UAE sources, is reporting that attackers used limpet mines attached to the hulls of the vessels. Although satellite images display no major damage to the tankers, this video shows that the Norwegian ship's hull has been visibly gouged. Whatever the case, there's no definitive evidence linking Tehran to the attacks, but there are already fears the situation could lead to an armed conflict. Last week, the White House ordered additional ships and aircraft into the region after warning of attacks from Iran
I forgot
and its
about that.
proxies. At this stage, there are still more questions than answers, but the concern now is that tensions could boil over into something far more serious. This morning, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels claim to have carried out drone attacks on Saudi installations. Gail.
Good. I mean, if the Houthis really did that, more power to them. But I don't buy it. So, could you guys hear that? Were you guys able to hear and see the video? Was it choppy? Just give me a little grade on that, just so I know if to do it differently next time. And if there's anybody in this chat who has experience using OBS, it's a freeware streaming piece of software. Please DM me on Twitter and help me out, because I need help using this. Okay, it looks like it worked out okay. So this actually, I forgot an event that happened last week where Trump did send aircraft carriers in response to some vague Iranian threat that they didn't explain or disclose. Now, right after this report, and just commentary on the Saudi oil tanker attacks, I mean, if you saw the damage in those videos, it's pretty minor. It doesn't seem like, they don't mention any casualties. So I'm assuming there weren't actually any deaths or even injuries from those. The damage to the ship seemed pretty small. I mean, so it's kind of shocking that Saudi Arabia and the Trump administration are trying to actually use that as a means to get us into Iran. I mean, it seems really, really weak. I'm just surprised that would be the spark that they would try to use. And simultaneously, it's coinciding with an article from May 13th from the New York Times, which is supposedly leaked plans by the Trump administration, internal war plans to go to war with Iran. I'll just read to you this article from May 13th by Eric Schmidt and Julianne Barnes from the New York Times. It says, at a meeting of President Trump's top national security aides last Thursday, Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan presented an updated military plan that envisions sending as many as 120,000 troops to the Middle East should Iran attack American forces or accelerate work on nuclear weapons, administration officials said. The revisions were ordered by hardliners led by John R. Bolton, Mr. Trump's national security advisor. They do not call for a land invasion of Iran, which would require vastly more troops, officials said. The development reflects the influence of Mr. Bolton, one of the administration's most virulent Iran hawks, whose push for confrontation with Tehran was ignored more than a decade ago by President George W. Bush. It is highly uncertain whether Mr. Trump, who has sought to disentangle the United States from Afghanistan and Syria, ultimately would send so many American forces back to the Middle East. It is also unclear whether the president has been briefed on the number of troops or other details in the plans. And there's actually a video of Trump responding before this report came out. And the New York Times goes on to say, on Monday, when asked about if he was seeking regime change in Iran, Mr. Trump said, "We'll see what happens with Iran. If they do anything, it would be a very bad mistake." So that's where most people started to get afraid, is when these war plans leaked. And, since the Trump administration is so contradictory, and while Trump is essentially a pathological liar, it's hard to really know what the fuck is actually going on. So here we go. Here's a clip of Trump actually responding to the New York Times piece I just read. And it's interesting what he has to say. Because remember, the New York Times piece I just read said that in the plans, this is not for a ground invasion of Iran. 120,000 troops, not for a full-on ground invasion. They would actually require more troops for that. So keep that in mind when you actually hear what Trump says. Because it's clearly he's lying on some level with what he says here. But he's fully aware of the report. So listen.
I think it's fake news, okay? Now, would I do that? Absolutely. But we have not planned for that. Hopefully we're not going to have to plan for that. And if we did that, we'd send a hell of a lot more troops than that. But I think it's just, where was that story? In the New York Times? Well, the New York Times is fake news.
See? He knows how to play the game. That was a smart, Trump has still got it in terms of knowing how to spin shit. That sounded, if you just weren't paying attention to things and you're just like, oh yeah, New York Times is fake news. Trump is not for war. Like, why would he do this? But in that response, he references the report and how 120,000 troops would not be enough to fully, quote unquote, win or whatever the hell our plans are in a ground invasion. He says, I'd send a hell of a lot more troops than that. He's already looked at the numbers. He's already looked at the strategic planning. So, yeah, that's interesting that he talks out both sides of his mouth. The plans to go to war, that he saw in his administration are fake news, but he'd send a hell of a lot more troops than 120,000 troops to go after Iran. So, yeah, that's pretty crazy. And again, there are people out there who will say that Trump is using the big stick approach, that Bolton is sort of his attack dog to scare people into submission, to be able to strike these deals. I just think that we'd be awfully naive to think that the U.S. empire is just going to stop now because Trump, in a casual, vague way says he wants to end regime change and pull our troops out. That promise that he made seems to have dissolved pretty quickly anyways. And I just think that we really need to brace ourselves for something insane. And you might be saying to yourself, well, maybe, nobody, no American's going to accept another Iraq war level, full-scale war like Iraq. People are tired of war. But I think you might be overestimating the American people. Look what happened after 9/11. Everybody was turned into a fear-mongered puddle and was willing to go along with anything. I mean, so I think that, yeah, like David said, I mean, all it will take, unfortunately, is another catalyzing event. And not just to go into a single country. I mean, like to actually go into, like to almost like to restart the energy of the war on terror. There needs to be another attack of some kind to restart and rekindle that fire. That fire is kind of, it's still burning. It's just kind of just a smoking pile right now. I don't feel like that energy can maintain the momentum that was required for the American people to just roll over and accept Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, all that stuff. I think another attack is required. So let me continue on with some other stories here, sort of in chronological order, about what's been happening with these movements towards war with Iran and why we should take them very seriously. Of course, Netanyahu has been stoking this for a while. He really wants to go to war with Iran. I mean, it seems like you can make the argument that war with Iran would be like something that we would be doing for Israel in a way that the Iraq war and the Afghanistan weren't quite in I guess that intense in terms of a gift to Israel. So on May 6th, May 9th of last year, Netanyahu actually said that Iran wants to destroy 6 million Jews. He evoked the Holocaust and basically said that Iran wants to do another Holocaust and kill that many Jews. And this is the same Likudnik Prime Minister of Israel who held up the cartoon bomb image, claiming that this is how close Iran was to building a nuke. We know that was a total lie. And we also know that the Obama administration, or at least the Iran deal itself, was not just designed to allow Iran to sort of, continue on without the barrel of U.S. imperialism breathing down their neck. It was also designed to prevent them from actually building nukes, too. So it's interesting that all this talk about, especially in the New York Times article that I just read about war plans, if they escalate their nuclear program, well, the deal itself was designed to stop that. So you could really make the argument that the Trump administration pulled out of the deal in order to play a game of chicken with Iran to see if they would actually make any movements whatsoever towards nuclear armaments as a means and an excuse to do something to them. And I don't even actually know if Iran's done that, because they're still in the deal with other countries. Just because America pulled out doesn't mean that they aren't continuing to abide by the deal. On May 13th, 2019, just a few days ago, an opinion piece for Newsweek came out saying the best way to avert war with Iran, fire John Bolton, he says. So I'm just going through his article to see if I actually agree with it. So he says, egged on by Bolton, President Trump is recklessly and needlessly restarting the Iranian nuclear crisis. If Trump is sincere about seeking a deal with Tehran, he has been misled on the efficacy of his approach by Bolton, which is only rapidly negating prospects for diplomatic compromise. Iranian officials have made clear their readiness for de-escalation and preference to remain in the JCPOA. That's the actual name for the Iranian nuclear deal. The major question now is whether Trump himself wants another major Middle Eastern war. A U.S. war against Iran is hard to imagine. Even a botched-up limited military strike has the potential risk to sink Trump's presidency, as happened with Jimmy Carter after the failure of Operation Eagle Claw in Iran. And then he ends the article by saying, Trump alone will have to face the music for this conflict going into 2020, not John Bolton. But so long as Bolton remains in the White House, the risk of such a war will keep growing. So I have some definite disagreements with his point of view there. Obviously, I think that part of the problem is making it appear that John Bolton has this much agency over the Trump administration and that Trump has this little agency over his own foreign policy decisions. This is the same man who said that he wants to kill terrorists and their families, that he wants to bring back torture. When people at rallies suggested that we should murder Muslims, he kind of like agrees with it. There's a clip I played on a Media Roots radio episode a few weeks ago where some guy is basically insinuating, like, what are we going to do to get rid of these people? Meaning Muslims. He's not talking about deporting them. He's talking about murdering and eradicating them. And Trump is like, well, we have some people looking into that. Like, Trump is a bloodthirsty monster. He hates Muslims. He hates Arabs. It's not a surprise. It's not because of Bolton. Thor Sock says it's not Bolton. It's the whole damn system. I mean, absolutely. The system is designed for war. But we need to let go of this idea that Trump is somehow a pacifist or he's an anti-interventionist or that he was even serious about pulling troops out of Afghanistan or Syria. I think we really need to acknowledge that just simply cannot be believed. And it is surprising to me that 2 years or more into his presidency, there are still people out there who want to put all the blame on John Bolton. And even this Newsweek article, I mean, yeah, maybe, not going into Iran would definitely help Trump's reelection chances. I mean, that part is true from the article. But Trump firing Bolton and somehow that's going to stop these war-making maneuvers, I think that's naive. I think that people might be surprised that Trump is actually very much in favor of and, maybe even behind some of the impetus to create some of these war plans in the first place. I mean, we really can't say, but to assume that this is all John Bolton's doing and to place all the blame even, I see a lot of progressives and leftists on Twitter saying this is Bolton's, Iran war plans, or this is Pompeo's Iran war plans. I just find that odd because those same people never gave that pass to Obama. Obama owned the Libyan war. Obama owned the Syrian rebel program. Obama owned the Syrian bombing campaign. Obama owned all that stuff. Obama owned the Ukraine coup. So why is Juan Guaido being, trying to do a coup in Venezuela? Why is that not Trump? Why doesn't Trump own that? Why doesn't Trump own these, his own neocons in his administration trying to go to war with Iran? This all seems to create this picture that Trump has no agency and that he, he's just a reality TV show star. He doesn't know anything about DC. He's just letting people run the show. I think on this specifically, I think on foreign policy, throwing his weight around, swinging his dick around, this is actually something that Trump's interested in being involved in. I think his ego and his personality has displayed that he is actually interested in being a bully on the world stage. So I don't think that, and of course, I'm sure on some level he does want to make peace with North Korea because that would make him look good in the history books. So there is sort of these dueling personalities where he wants these accolades. He really rushed that North Korean summit. I mean, it does. And again, I've brought this point up before. Trump and Obama do have similarities where they both seem very, very interested in solidifying this legacy for themselves as being sort of these world peacemaker dignitary types before they actually accomplish a goddamn thing. Obama wins a Nobel Peace Prize right after he gets in office. And it's just what did you do? You just said you were going to do all this good shit and you're doing a bunch of bad shit. And then Trump, tries to rush this, diplomatic summit with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. And then that's already falling apart. I mean, it just seemed like it was more important for him to get the photo op and the accolades than it was to actually accomplish the goal. I mean, I don't, and maybe someone might disagree with me on that, but I think that I can assess that that's sort of what Trump's modus operandi is to a certain degree here. So when it comes to all these rumors coming out, like the Washington Post and even the Federalist had these leaked conversations where apparently Trump was sort of thinking about firing John Bolton, and that he was mad that John Bolton was trying to push him into war and this and that. I think there actually might be some truth to that. But I would argue that the truth is probably more nuanced, where Trump, he's not anti-war. He's just anti-getting us into like a quagmire. He doesn't want to lose the political capital of doing some kind of military action and then getting us wrapped up into a quagmire where the public support starts to like dwindle by the day for him. I believe that he would be completely for every war put on his desk if we could get in there fast, get in there strong, hit him hard, and get out and declare victory. Like that, like Trump is actually pro-war in that framework. He just doesn't want to take on the cost of being involved in a quagmire and looking bad. And a lot of people were like, "Oh, that Syria bombing was a fake bombing and whatever." He warned the Russians beforehand or whatever. I mean, I think that was, he did that. That's his style. He wants to do these quick, sort of clean, hit him hard and get out of there kind of things. And I think that was sort of him testing the waters. The Moab was a similar thing. I don't think it's a coincidence that a Moab was used on an ISIS cave, right when he got in office. That's definitely a difference between something Obama would have done. And Teresa says Trump is doing whatever he's been told to, just a selected puppet. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that there is a mixture here. Trump is the commander in chief. He does still have agency. He can still make executive orders. He can still decide to launch a nuclear strike. There are definitely people trying to puppeteer him, but I also think he has his own agency, just as every president before him has had their own agency. Choco Doan says, "Why are you talking on behalf of Trump? You aren't him." I don't know. Why does any news commentator try to analyze his behavior or his words or his actions? I mean, he's an all over the place, kind of schizophrenically behaving president. So, I believe that it's kind of important to try to analyze his behavior and actually figure out what's going on here, because there's so many contradictory narratives. So I'm not sure where that guy's coming from, but I'm going to be doing that more on this podcast, so you might want to get out now if you don't want to hear me do that anymore. So I'm going to continue reading some other articles here. So there's actually a New York Times article that came out a day after those original war plans that says, "Skeptical U.S. allies resist Trump's new claims of threats from Iran." So notice again, this is a slightly different paradigm. Well, not slightly, it's very different paradigm from when Trump launched those original attacks on Syria. Because you remember Macron, I think even Justin Trudeau, and Theresa May were all doing speeches sort of at the same time promoting this sort of like joint bombing campaign on Syria. So the article says, as the Trump administration draws up war plans against Iran over what it says are threats to American troops and interests, a senior British military official told reporters at the Pentagon on Tuesday that he saw no increased risk from Iran or allied militias in Iraq and Syria. A few hours later, the United States Central Command issued an unusual rebuke. The remarks from the British official, Major General Chris Geika, who was also the deputy commander of the American-led coalition fighting the Islamic State, run, quote, counter to the identified credible threats available to intelligence from U.S. and allies regarding Iranian-backed forces in the region. The rare public dispute highlights a central problem for the Trump administration as it seeks to rally allies in global opinion against Iran. So that's a good sign. I mean, the British, the military, British politicians and military commanders are usually fully on board with every, a potential war-making maneuver that the United States government does. So that's a good sign. If that's already happening, I mean, apparently this actually happened at the Pentagon itself. This British general contradicted the administration while at the Pentagon, and he later had to be rebuked by an American general. So that's a little bit different. Same day, another article came out from Reuters saying U.S. pressures Baghdad over Iran-backed militias. It says Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's surprise visit to Baghdad this month came after U.S. intelligence showed Iran-backed Shiite militias positioning rockets near bases housing U.S. forces. He told Iraq's top brass to keep the militias, which are expanding their power in Iraq and now form part of its security apparatus, in check, the sources said. If not, the U.S. would respond with force. A senior Iraqi military source with knowledge of Pompeo's trip said, they said if the U.S. were attacked on Iraqi soil, it would take action to defend itself without coordinating with Baghdad. Very interesting. So they're definitely moving the goalposts up here in order to basically just make it more easier and grease the skids for a confrontation with Iran. Because if you remember, we've been told this whole time in Syria and Iraq that Iran already had militias there and they were killing our troops and all this shit. To what level of truth they're actually telling there, I don't know. I think it's mostly bullshit. But that's what they were trying to say. So now it's like, oh, these Iranian militias are pointing, rockets or aiming, at U.S. troops as targets. And if they do anything, we're going to attack them without coordinating with anything with you guys. So that is definitely a new stage of this. They're just, they're moving up the goalposts. They're making it easier for them to just eventually, I guess, try to do something really ballsy like a military attack in Iran. Another article from May 15th.
We'll see what happens with Iran. If they do anything, it will be...
Okay. So actually, I might as well play this clip too. Here's another just weird Trump clip about him talking about Iran. Give me a second to cue this up. And this is from, I don't know when this video is recorded, but the article it's embedded in is from today. But I don't think this clip is from today. So here's Trump again being asked by reporters about the possibility of military confrontation with Iran.
We'll see what happens with Iran. If they do anything, it will be a very bad mistake. If they do anything, I'm hearing little stories about Iran. If they do anything, they will suffer greatly. We'll see what happens with Iran.
We fundamentally do not seek a war with Iran. We've also made clear to the Iranians that if American interests are attacked, we will most certainly respond in an appropriate fashion.
So as you can see, there's some very mixed messages there, and that's not uncommon with Trump's administration. I mean, even just from one person. How could Mike Pompeo possibly say that we're not looking for a war with Iran when they're doing they're just trying to escalate things to the point where that's what they're going to get. So, yeah, it's odd. The games they're playing with the rhetoric here. So this is something that's been happening. This is why I'm taking this more seriously, and I'm not just seeing this as, saber rattling rhetoric. This article from Foreign Policy talks about how today. Hold on a second. Yeah. So today, it says that the coalition in Iraq, an email, CENTCOM spokesperson Captain Bill Urban, announced that the coalition is now at a high level of alert, and it continues to monitor possibly imminent threats to U.S. forces in Iraq, he added. And the article from Foreign Policy says, in response to the new threat, the State Department on Wednesday ordered all non-emergency U.S. government employees to evacuate, both at the embassy in Baghdad and the consulate in Erbil. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made a last-minute trip to Iraq on May 7th to meet with top Iraqi officials and brief them on the situation. So they're pulling personnel out right now as a response to this. So there's some serious movements being made here. And this is strange too, is that along with all of this, the administration doesn't seem to have much support from the people that would typically be supporting them, meaning like the mainstream media and people like Lindsey Graham and some of these neocon marionettes in government. This is from The Hill from today, May 15th. This is what Lindsey Graham had to say, and this is actually quite surprising to me. He says that he and other lawmakers haven't been adequately briefed by the Trump administration about the growing threat posed by Iran amid growing tensions between Washington and Tehran. Graham, the chairman of the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee and a top ally of President Trump, said senators have been largely kept in the dark as the U.S. sends an aircraft carrier strike group and bombers to the Middle East. Quote, no, I feel we haven't been well informed, and I'm writing a letter with Senator Leahy today to try to get a briefing, end quote. Graham said Wednesday afternoon.
We'll see what happens with Iran if they do anything.
Oh, shit, sorry. I don't think it's fair for us to walk around wondering, he said, reflecting broader concerns among Senate GOP colleagues about the fast-moving events in the Middle East. Asked about the threat posed by Iran and a report by the New York Times that Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan has drawn up a plan to send as many as 120,000 troops to the Middle East, Graham said, I don't know. I just know what I read. The president has said it wasn't true. But Graham said he's concerned by the State Department's decision to partially evacuate the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad in response to intelligence of possible Iranian-backed threats. We're clearly moving people, he said. That is a big deal. We had people there during the height of the war. If we could stay in operation then, during the height of the Iraq war, it must be some kind of real threat. And then even Senator Rubio is acting like he's not being given enough information. So that's an interesting. I think that's actually a positive silver lining here. If the Trump administration is doing this in such an obnoxious sort of like going at it alone kind of way, then that might give us some hope, I guess, or at least it gives me some hope that this might not actually happen. Thor Socks in the chat says ExxonMobil has reportedly evacuated its staff from Basra oil fields in southern Iraq. Yikes. Jesus Christ. If you have any links for that, please send. Please send it. And that's very interesting. If corporations are already being tipped off And just as a side note, like on the podcast, I tend not to pontificate as much as I have the urge to sometimes about just random shit, because I'm doing it with Abby, and I have more of a responsibility on these live streams. I might occasionally just go off on some kind of crazy sounding shit that you might be surprised by, or even stuff I haven't talked about on the podcast because I haven't been able to prove, or I only maybe had one source, or I heard it from the source of a source. But something that I've been really interested in, and I haven't really followed up on much, is I know someone who knows someone who is very close to the Department of Energy and the CIA. And this person claims when they were contracted by the CIA, one of the main jobs that they were responsible for was assessing intelligence gathered from oil wells. And their whole, basically the picture they were trying to paint for me was that the CIA is fully aware of peak oil and are working with global oil companies and feeding them intelligence based on their own people on the ground, going into these countries, pretending to be oil workers or whatever, and actually helping these companies prepare for peak oil and giving them a preview as to how much oil there is actually left in these oil wells. And apparently, they basically come to the conclusion that it's just as bad as people like Mike Rupert were saying it was. And that CIA agents and assets are around the world right now embedded in oil companies or posing as oil field workers, I don't know what, monitoring the oil well situation and actually trying to figure out how much oil is actually really left and how much time we have left to abuse it. Because, I mean, even just the idea that we've used this much fossil fuel in such a short amount of time is absolutely absurd. I mean, that Art Bell, Alex Jones, I mean, I don't know who else perpetuated this theory that fossil fuel self-regenerates or something, that it's like that it just keeps coming back in these pockets in the earth. I mean, that's obviously not true. This was a substance that we discovered and just fucking were super spoiled. We're just like, let's just use it all. So I don't even know how I got off on that tangent, but I don't even remember. But I'm always interested in the intersection between oil companies and the CIA and these sort of foreign policy maneuvers. Because, yeah, we always hear, I've been hearing since I was in elementary school, that the Iraq war was for oil, But when you hear the actual details, or when you find out these stories that involve specific things that oil companies have done, bad things where they've, worked with intelligence agencies or the Pentagon, to me, it gets really interesting. And there's so much, I mean, there's just so many different stories there. So, but yeah, please send me any links about this ExxonMobil evacuation in Iraq. Somebody says it's true. Oil is always replenishing. I don't believe that. I think that's junk science. I think that it's very clear that oil is a finite resource. Actually, most things on this planet are finite resources. That's something that, most scientists have now agreed with, that there's pretty much peak everything. There's peak helium. I mean, like we're having a helium shortage right now. Because they just like cracked they've just, I don't know what vein of helium. I think it might have been in India or something. I mean, there is peak everything. So, yeah, that's real. David Wint says civilization will collapse long before we deplete the Earth's fossil fuel supply. That's probably true. I would say that's a fair point. But one thing you're not factoring in, David, is that the people who are aware of and have the foreknowledge of, and the people in power, the oligarchs who are aware of the collapse of fossil fuel and peak oil, are already doing things now to change the world to prepare for that. So I think you can't really. It's like once it actually is gone, there will have been like 20 years of damage in its wake preceding it, and we're in that stage right now, as well. It's just a similar thing to climate change. I mean, one of the first major terrible events to happen in climate change won't be the water levels rising. It won't be a drastic change in temperatures. What it'll be, according to a lot of scientists, is that people who work on the equator, outdoors, a lot of agriculture that's done with human manual labor that can't be automated, they're already working in such hot conditions that if the temperature even raised just a tiny bit, a fraction of a degree, they would be physically incapable of working in those conditions. So that will be one of the first things that'll happen, and that's kind of already happening now. And yeah, I mean, we won't. It's like once we start seeing the day after tomorrow style catastrophic signs of some of these things, it will already be way too late, and the damage will have already been done. So I think it's kind of interesting to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how these apocalyptic scenarios will actually unfold, and sort of the first stages of what will happen before it gets to something you would see out of a Hollywood film. Okay, so I got a little off track there, to say the least, but the last thing I read was kind of good news, that people like Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, they're not necessarily in the loop with the Trump administration's plans to bomb or attack Iran. For whatever reason, they're not fully in the loop this time. That's interesting. David is correct. The global food system, yes. And the global food system, especially where agriculture is done in the hottest areas of the planet already, that's what will be affected first, and it'll kind of emanate outward from there. I've tried to think of a movie or an apocalyptic scenario that's kind of that feels the most realistic to me, and it's probably like the environment of Interstellar. How it's just like a massive dust bowl, where all where just like dust everywhere. To me, that kind of seems like the most realistic out of like all the Hollywood like scenarios of things falling apart. So this is something slightly different from what we've already read. This is from May 15th today. It was posted by Reuters about an hour ago. It goes into more detail about the evacuation of U.S. personnel. It says that helicopters ferried U.S. staff from the American Embassy in Baghdad on Wednesday out of apparent concern about perceived threats from Iran, which U.S. sources believe encouraged Sunday's attacks on 4 oil tankers in the Gulf. A U.S. government source said American security experts believe Iran gave its, quote, blessing to tanker attacks, which hit 2 Saudi crude oil tankers. The source said the United States believes Iran's role was one of actively encouraging militants, but indicated the United States does not have evidence that Iranian personnel played any direct operational role. Iran's foreign minister has called the tanker attacks worrisome and dreadful and called for an investigation. Oh, and of course, who can forget that only like a month ago, the Trump administration designated the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, an official branch of the military, as a foreign terrorist organization. I mean, this is all part of the escalation. Those are war-making maneuvers. Oh, God. I hope this person in the chat is joking. Teresa Peterson just said, the calm before the storm that Trump told us about. Well, I knew it wasn't going to be long before I had someone parroting QAnon phrases in the chat. Welcome. Enjoy. You should probably go back and watch some of my other streams about QAnon and how it's a neocon psyop. So there's just a couple interesting things besides that pop out to me in that article. That this is a refined version of the original idea that it was an Iranian attack. A source said that it was actively encouraging militants, but no direct operational role. Not sure what that means. The headline oddly says that U.S. sources said that Iran gave its blessing for tanker attacks. And I don't know why that's in quotes, if that's a paraphrase. I can't find it. Yeah, I guess the source apparently did say that Iran gave its blessing, whatever the fuck that means. It makes it almost sound like they're the mob or something. I mean, it creates this sort of specter of like something that's like, oh yeah, that's how they do things over there. It's like there's those weird foreign countries and their mafia-like corrupt ways. It's like, what the fuck does that mean? They gave their blessing. What, like, apply that to the United States? What would that mean here? I mean, did Mike Morrell give his blessing for a massive attack on Russian soldiers in Syria by saying that we need to kill Iranians and Russians to teach them a lesson? Did he give his blessing? And I'll let the chat answer that. Is that what that is? They approached the Ayatollah on his daughter's wedding day. L and F, who are you referring to? That's interesting. I don't know who you mean, they. If Life is a Leaf says, all the U.S. accusations about Iran proxies, they're claiming all Shia are Iran proxies, but over a third of the population of Iraq is Shia and always was. Yeah, there's definitely some misrepresentation of the ethnic makeup of Iranians, and I mean not just that, but the idea that Iran sponsors all this terrorism across the world. I mean, it's completely bogus. And the argument does hold up that, if you want to talk about a single country that sponsors the most terrorism, that we can openly point to, it's either the United States or Saudi Arabia. And if we're talking about specifically a certain type of like Muslim ideology, we just got to get into specifics here. So obviously, I mean, talking in these generalities about, the way that the American government always has, or, the Trump administration now talks about Iran being behind the world's most terrorist attacks. I mean, it's even just the word terrorism, it all allows you to speak in such generalities that you don't have to really speak any truth. You can just fearmonger. I mean, this is really what all this language is for. Okay, I'm just looking in the chat, see if there's anything. If you guys have any questions, I'm probably going to be on here for another 10 minutes. Just got a few more things to read and comment on. I'll check the chat like once every minute until I log off. Do you think Trump is going to pull back on this Iran escalation like he did with the DPRK? You know, I don't think so, because as much as I've been trying to talk about how Trump has agency and he's largely responsible for this, and you can't blame it all on John Bolton. I do think that there are so many forces here interested in taking down Iran, globally and just in the United States. And it's been going for it's like a slow motion kind of build up against Iran. I don't think that it's going to lead to something like a summit or anything like that. God, I hope so, though. I mean, it would be horrific if Trump actually did something to Iran. It would be, I mean, it's so horrific, and this is what I was actually going to read to you next, was that people like David Frum and Eli Lake are pretending like they think it's a bad idea. I mean, I don't know if they're pretending or they changed their mind. I mean, to me, a neocon's always a neocon, but I'm about to read to you 2 articles where both Eli Lake and David Frum act like we shouldn't do this, which is just strange, you know? I'm actually surprised. Like, when they're actually given the opportunity to finally do it, they kind of back away from it. And I don't know if it's just because Trump is the president or what. What's actually going on here? This is hilarious. David Frum for The Atlantic today at 3:30 p.m. says, headline, take it from an Iraq war supporter. War with Iran would be a disaster. David Frum. He says, the Iraq War of 2003 was undone by blithe assumptions, cultural ignorance, and careless planning. Oh my God. This disgusting motherfucker. But compared with the accelerating dive to confront Iran, the Iraq War looks like a masterpiece of meticulous preparation. Okay. So his critique so far is that he's acknowledging that the Iraq War was a disaster, but this war is so ill-planned or just poorly put together that it makes the Iraq War look like a masterpiece of meticulous preparation, he says. Can you just imagine, just think about how arrogant this motherfucker is for being part of something that killed over 500,000 Iraqis that we know of on paper. I mean, some estimates say over 1 million. And he's just acting like, like it was undone by cultural ignorance and careless planning. And I mean, just the psychotic arrogance in that. So he continues on to say, the project of a war with Iran is so crazy, it remains incredible that Donald Trump's administration could truly be premeditating it. But on the off chance that it is, here's a word of caution from a veteran of the George W. Bush administration. Don't do it. What the fuck? Okay, so I'm just going to stop here for comments. Anybody have any comments on David Frum's article so far? You guys taking this at face value? Do you think that he really doesn't want to go into Iran? Okay, I'll continue to read. Nobody had anything to say. I supported the Iraq War in 2003 because I believe the Bush administration's case that Iraq was again actively seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. A first program had been destroyed by Israeli warplanes in 1981. A second had been halted by UN inspectors after the Gulf War of 1990. Yet the goal in 2003 was bigger than denuclearization. Iraq's Saddam Hussein was both oppressing his own subjects and menacing his neighbors. By replacing Saddam's regime with a more humane and peaceful successor, the U.S. could set the Arab Middle East on a path to a better future, contributing to America's own security after 9/11. Oh my God! This is so... Okay, this is just ridiculous. I still think that President Bush did right to warn the world of an axis of evil in his 2002 State of the Union address, a speech to which I made some modest contributions. Back then, it was controversial to claim that North Korea was proliferating weapons technologies to Iran and Syria, or that Shiite Iran armed and supplied Sunni Hamas. These things are now universally known, but the step from describing the problem to acting on it was large and inadequately considered. So this is just the arrogance. I mean, and then he says, the idea of repeating such a war only on a much bigger scale, without allies, without justification, and without any plan at all for what comes next, staggers and terrifies the imagination. Okay, let's analyze that sentence for a second. On a much bigger scale. Okay, how big was the Iraq War? Like, was it small? No, I mean, we know for sure that they killed over 500,000 people. That's pretty much a genocide. Pretty big country. He says, without allies. Okay, what allies did we have during the Iraq War? The UK? And that's pretty much it? I mean, what other, like... We had Poland. I mean, Bush, it became a national joke that Bush kept saying, what about Poland? You forgot Poland. I mean, we didn't really have any allies with us. And then he says, without justification. No justification for the Iraq War whatsoever. None. Zero. So, this is just a fucking joke. I don't even really know what to make of this, though, because why is he saying... Is it just because Trump is in power? I mean, like, why doesn't he want this? Anybody have any comments on that? I'm going to go let my dog out while you guys ask questions like that. Okay. John Vaha says, it's possible Frum is sincere. Not sure, but it's obvious to any rational person how dumb and based on lies this march to war with Iran is. I mean, do you think that he just doesn't think that Trump administration is putting out good enough propaganda? I mean, because if he's sincere on not wanting us to invade Iran based on these circumstances, do you think it's just these circumstances? Or do you think that under different circumstances with better propaganda, he would be like for it? I think I kind of agree with what you're saying. I do think he is sincere in the regard that he doesn't want this administration doing it under these circumstances. But that if the circumstances were different, I do think he could possibly get on board with something even behind this administration. John Gold says the world doesn't want war with Iran. I mean, I think that's definitely true. Iran is a player in the world, you know, the world economy. They're not they're not even really. I mean, I don't know if people would even call their government socialist. I know that they have free healthcare and things like that. I don't really actually know very much about that, but they're a world player in the global economy, and especially since there was talk about the nuclear deal. From what I understand, there was a lot of loosening up of just sort of economic trade rules in general, leading up to that point. That a lot of people have a vested interest in doing business with Iran. So just for that reason alone, I think that it has more, I guess, global importance than Iraq did, which sounds kind of disgusting to say, but just in terms of like the global economy and the way other world leaders perceive the situation, I think that they have less of an interest of wanting to get on board with a military assault on Iran compared to Iraq. I mean, unless there is some kind of other 9/11 style major attack that they can somehow blame on Iran. I mean, that's the only way I could see something like that. The world community getting behind that. So I guess the only other thing I wanted to read to you guys was another neocon, Eli Lake, who writes for Bloomberg. He used to often write with his co-writer Josh Rogan for Bloomberg. They both used to write for the Daily Beast. He has an article out today saying how Congress can help Trump deter Iran. And the subheadline says, an invasion would be foolish, but Congress should give more support to the president's pressure campaign. Apparently, he says, death to America should be taken seriously, but not literally. At least that's the implication of the quote that Iran's supreme leader gave to state media on Tuesday. There won't be any war, said Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. We don't seek a war. In light of recent events, this seems a bit weird. Last week, the U.S. announced the early deployment of an aircraft carrier and bomber task force to the Persian Gulf to deter what acting Defense Secretary Pat Shanahan called a credible threat by Iranian forces. Over the weekend, the United Arab Emirates reported that 4 vessels in its territorial waters were attacked by sabotage. Wait a second. This is interesting. I mean, I heard this in one of the reports, but it says Eli Lake reports in Bloomberg that on Tuesday, Yemeni Houthi forces launched a drone attack on 2 Saudi oil facilities. Do we know that for certain? I mean, where? I don't remember. I don't remember seeing any evidence for that or proof of that. So somebody can pull that up. So basically, the point of Eli Lake's article is he thinks that it's a bad idea to send ground troops to Iran, but he thinks that we should continue to use like the big stick approach and put pressure on them to try to like scare them into submission. So he ends the article by saying, but there is ample evidence that Iran responds to pressure and threats. So a non-binding congressional resolution warning Khamenei not to escalate against U.S. forces or allies in the region might serve as a useful deterrent. Okay. So he's actually not saying, he doesn't actually takes a less hawkish, more hawkish position than David Frum in there. Just looking at the chat really quick. Okay, so the final neocon I'm going to read to you a report about. He didn't actually write this, but it's goes along the lines of Eli Lake and David Frum. I almost forgot his name for a second. It goes along the lines of Eli Lake and David Frum, both acting like they don't want Trump to do this Iran war thing. So here's a statement from Netanyahu. Came out earlier today. This is from Axios.com. At a special meeting on U.S.-Iran tensions with Israel's intelligence chiefs and top military brass, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel would make every effort not to get dragged into the escalation in the Gulf and would not interfere directly in the situation. Interesting. I mean, that's not really. I wish there was an actual like quote we could find from Netanyahu. But this is like, an Israeli intelligence officials are the source for this article. But still interesting that Netanyahu is acting like he's not going to help the United States out if they do this. So it's very, very bizarre. God, it's so weird. I mean, I don't understand. It does seem sloppy. I mean, so if anything, the silver lining here is that even neocons like David Frum are already not wanting to attach their names to this because it seems really sloppy. Like that was David Frum's main criticism. You know, he acted like there was no justification. Well, there wasn't a justification for the Iraq War either. So really, the only real criticism that he had that maybe holds water is that this seems sloppy. And the propaganda for it seems kind of just sloppy. So even if they do something, you know, at the end of this broadcast, I'm actually a little more hopeful after reading some of this because it does seem like there won't be very much public support or even like media support for this if the Trump administration tries to do something. So let's just hope that, you know, some kind of Gulf of Tonkin style bullshit doesn't take place, or if it does, that the media is smart enough to not go along with it. Because this is there are some positive signs here that this is not going to be a lockstep endeavor. This is different than what we've seen so far, with Trump making military maneuvers, his administration saber rattling like this. And just to counter what I just said with some healthy, you know, counter content. I'm going to play for you a clip with Tom Cotton being interviewed May 14th, yesterday, about what would happen if we went to war with Iran. Could we win a war with Iran? He's asked. Okay, here we go.
Could we win a war with Iran?
Yes.
That didn't take you a second.
2 strikes, the first strike and the last strike.
What are the conditions or the circumstances that would justify going to war with Iran?
Well, if Iran struck out militarily against the United States or against our allies in the region, then I would certainly expect a devastating response against Iran.
As somebody who fought in 2 fronts in the Middle East, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, do you think it would be a good idea to go to war with Iran?
No, I don't advocate military action against Iran. I'm simply delivering the message that if Iran were to attack the United States, it would be a grave miscalculation on their part, and there would be a furious response. Now, we don't want to govern Iran. We don't want to rule 80 million Iranians. We want 80 million Iranians to be able to govern themselves.
Where are you on regime change?
What I want is to have an outlaw regime change its behavior, to rejoin the civilized world and stop supporting terrorism and trying to overthrow the governments of so many of its neighbors. Ultimately, it's up to the Iranian people and their leaders to decide how they're going to govern their country. But with men like those in charge of Iran, I think we're going to see what we've seen for the last 40 years, which is a revolutionary theological movement that's hijacked the powers of a nation state.
I wonder if that means on any level to you that war is inevitable.
War is never inevitable. War is always the product of human choices.
Wow. Well, I guess I'll end on that note, that there are people out there who are really seemingly hungry for this. So even though David Frum is openly writing, this is Tom Cotton as Bill Kristol's marionette. So there has to be forces in this country that are still really hungry for something like this. So just, don't take your eye off the ball and, hold people's feet to the fire over this issue. And just, war, Trump trying to make war in general with any country, Venezuela, Iran, whatever comes down the pipeline. So this is me signing off for today. If you want to support me, I don't have my own Patreon page yet, but for now you can either donate through PayPal at the email address videohoax@hotmail.com, or through the Media Roots Radio Patreon site, patreon.com/Media Roots Radio. So thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.